Hello and welcome. In this episode, I am going to share some unnerving crawler encounters I came across on the internet. These stories include a bizarre encounter in southern Wisconsin, a potential crawler encounter in Canada, and an encounter in the woods of Tennessee. But first, we start with a story from upstate New York where a young man and his friends encountered a strange creature one night. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes from a poster relaying what happened to his brother one night at a local lake where they live in upstate New York. The original poster, or OP, says he lives about an hour north of New York City in a rural area with a lot of woods. The lake where his brother had his encounter has railroad tracks running alongside it, and there is said to be some abandoned mines farther into the woods. The OP says after hearing what his brother encountered out there one night, he does not want to find out. He also noticed that the lake was quite the party spot. His brother and 3 friends were out at the lake one night drinking and walking down the tracks, heading toward a rope swing. One of his friends had a flashlight, and as they walked down the tracks, they came to a stop when they saw 2 huge eyes reflect in the light. At first, they thought the eyes belonged to an animal as whatever they belonged to stared at the group. Their first guess was a deer. However, the OP's brother stood at 6'7", and the eyes were just higher than his. Still not knowing what was watching them, they figured it would run away if they ran at it. But as they charged toward whatever was in the tree staring at them, it didn't move a muscle. It remained right where it was, just staring at them. The fact that this creature didn't run off like a normal animal should have really freaked out the brother and his friends. The tracks had loose rocks lying around, so he and his friends started throwing them at what was staring at them. This is when the creature took off, running faster than anything the OP's brother had ever seen. This especially caught his attention due to how tall this thing was perceived to be based on the height of the eyes. So this thing was not only as big as his 6'7" brother, but it also moved with incredible speed. Adding to the eeriness of the speed was no one heard footsteps as this thing ran away. Instead, they just heard the rustling of leaves as if they were blowing in the wind. The friend holding the flashlight tried to track the creature with it, but she could only illuminate this thing's leg, which was very large and white. They also said it had an extra joint just below the knee and above the calf. It looked to them like an insect's leg. The OP says he always got the creeps in that area at night and plans to never go back to the lake at night after hearing his brother's story. While researching what the creature could have been, they came across the rake, which is a fictitious creature based on the crawler. This led to him posting his story alongside other crawler stories since the creature his brother saw resembled this particular type of cryptid. He ends his post by saying there have been UFO sightings in the area around the lake dating back to the 80s. It's interesting to me how many crawler stories involve abandoned mines, caves, or something similar being nearby or in the area. There are vast cave systems throughout the United States, and it would make sense if these beings lived in them. It would account for them being able to avoid detection and for their very pale appearance. A lot of these cave systems are unexplored, and we don't know how deep they actually go. So it's kind of like the ocean in that we don't know what could be down there. The OP also mentions always being creeped out in that area at night. So if this thing did live in the abandoned mines and only came out at night, then it would make sense why he would feel that way. Another thing I found interesting about this one is the UFO sightings in the area. There are so many stories about cryptids where people say they have also seen a lot of UFO activity in the area. There are theories suggesting there is a link between UFOs and cryptids, and the fact that there are a lot of sightings in the areas with heavy UFO activity certainly adds credence to this theory. As for what the OP's brother and his friends saw, there were 2 huge eyes reflected in the light, at a height taller than the OP's brother, who stands at 6'7", the speed at which this thing ran away, and the description of the large white leg. All of these things fit with this creature being a crawler. However, that is just speculation at this point without a full sighting and description of this creature. But I did include it with other crawler stories because it definitely seems like that's what it could have been. What do you think the OP's brother and his friends saw out there that night? And what do you think about these creatures making abandoned mines and caves their homes? Also, do you believe there's any correlation between UFO sightings and cryptid activity? The next story comes to us from a poster who had a very bizarre encounter with a creature one night in Wisconsin. The encounter had such an impact on her that she went back out to the area and once again had a strange experience. Her story takes place near Brodhead, Wisconsin. Brodhead is located in the southern part of Wisconsin, south of Madison and northwest of Rockford. It is in a mostly rural location and has a population of 3,724 as of the 2020 census. The original poster had gone out for a walk one night at around 8:30 p.m. on a trail near the Sugar River Raceway. She had ventured out there to gather sticks and dried plants for an art project. It was winter and 28 degrees out, so she left her car running, knowing she'd be quick in her task. So, leaving the car behind, she started down the trail with her headphones in, and not even 20 seconds into her walk, she caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. This prompted her to take her headphones out, and as soon as she did, she began hearing movement and creaking in the shrubs to her right. This was accompanied by the melting and cracking of ice beneath the brush. This is when she began to feel uneasy. She dismissed the uneasiness she was experiencing and continued walking down the trail, but she didn't get far before something sitting in the middle of the path about 40 feet in front of her brought her to a stop. She watched the figure for about 5 seconds before she realized what she was looking at. What she saw was a large silhouette crouched down on all fours that had a human-like head. The head was positioned in such a way that, compared to the body, the OP knew without a doubt that this thing was not human. It stood there unmoving, and even though she could not see any of this thing's features, she knew it was staring right at her. She felt her heart drop and instinct took over as she turned and ran back to her car. When she was back in the safety of her vehicle, she repositioned it so she could shine the headlights down the trail. But whatever had been there was gone. She turned her bright lights on then and gathered the necessary courage to venture down the path a little ways to look for a logical explanation for what she saw, such as a giant pile of sticks, brush, or anything else that might have played tricks on her eyes. But there was nothing there that resembled what she saw. She did some research and was convinced it was not some sort of nocturnal animal native to southern Wisconsin. She knew in her gut that something about the creature was not right, and crawler came to mind. In an update to her encounter, she says she could not shake off the urge to revisit the area where she saw the creature. So she drove back out to the trail the next night and parked her car so her headlights were pointed down the trail, just like she had after her encounter. She sat in her car for a few minutes looking for anything moving within the trees. She mentions it was a lot colder during this trip and the wind was blowing, kicking up the snow. This, along with the fog, made it even more eerie than it was the previous night. She didn't see anything out of the ordinary, and the only movement she saw was that of the plants and shrubs blowing in the wind. After sitting there for a few minutes watching, she finally got out of her car, leaving her door open, and immediately felt uneasy. That's when she heard movement in the brush to her right, but she dismissed it, telling herself it was probably just an animal and that she was being ridiculous. She pulled out her phone and took some pictures of the area to post alongside her story, but when she got home and looked at them, she thought she saw something amongst the trees. She does say it could very well be her looking for something out there because of her encounter and seeing what she wanted to see. But she can't help but think she may have caught the thing she saw on the trail in her pictures. She ends her post saying that the pictures are inconclusive. On a side note, when looking at the pictures, once they are zoomed in, there is something there that looks like it could be a creature. It is a whitish color, looks like it could be a humanoid, and there look to be 2 black eyes. However, the picture is too blurry to tell if what she points out is anything or not. If I'm being honest, I probably would have done the exact same thing the OP did and got out of there as quickly as possible if I saw something like that ahead of me on a trail. However, it is often said that in these stories, the worst thing you can do is run from a cryptid, especially a crawler, skinwalker, or wendigo. But when you are faced with the unknown and instincts kick in, you do what you need to do to get yourself out of that situation. Oftentimes, I hear people in these stories talk about how they feel the need to revisit the area where they saw what they did. I would never recommend this, as it could draw the attention of these beings and they could possibly attach themselves to you. There is a phenomenon known as the hitchhiker effect, where these beings take a special interest in someone and follow them home. This usually happens when someone goes out with the intention of finding and/or interacting with these creatures. So if you are unlucky enough to come across one of these beings, it's best to not try to investigate or go back out looking for these things. As for what the OP saw, judging based on her description of the silhouette of this creature, the dimensions definitely make me think crawler. However, without a more detailed description, I can't say for certain I believe that's what this thing was. In any case, I agree with her that I don't think what she saw was a normal animal. What do you think she saw on the path? And would you have gone back to further investigate? The next story comes to us from British Columbia in Canada. The original poster does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that it was near Smithers. He had ventured into the mountains about an hour and a half to a place that could only be reached by dirt roads. He says he has tried to completely forget the incident ever happened, but has been unable to because he cannot find a rational explanation for what he experienced. He was at his campsite inside his tent trying to get some sleep at around midnight. Near where he was camped, there were a lot of dead trees that creaked when the wind blew. He describes the sound as being loud and distinct. He notes that his surroundings were dead silent and still that night. It was then that he started to hear the cracking of sticks under footsteps that were slowly moving closer and closer to his camp. This continued for the next 15 minutes. The OP was sure that there was a bear approaching his tent and got so close it was about 15 feet from him. He decided to yell really loud, but his scream was met with silence. He describes the silence as deafening. No footsteps running away or anything. No sound whatsoever. He sat for about 20 minutes completely engulfed by the absolute silence around him, before he heard what he describes as an eerie, unnatural, unexplainable noise. It was the same sound as the dead trees swaying in the wind and sounded exactly like it, matching the timbre and volume of the creaking trees, but the same note was held for more than 5 seconds. The OP described it as an unnatural noise that was definitely not a creaking tree. He also noticed that there was no wind and no other trees moving or creaking when he heard the mysterious noise. He hardly slept that night and says the day after was hard for him as well. He ends his post by saying it could have been a skinwalker and asks if anyone has had anything similar happen to them or has any thoughts on what this thing could have been and to let him know. Even though the OP's first guess was a skinwalker, I included this story with other crawler stories because he posted it alongside them, thinking it could be a possible explanation for whatever approached his tent. Without a physical description, it is hard to say for sure what this thing was, but crawlers are said to be able to mimic sounds and voices. It had to be an unnerving experience to hear something walk up on your tent like that in the middle of the night, then start mimicking the sound of the trees. And when everything was completely still with no wind at all? The absolute stillness he describes in the area and the mimicking leave little doubt to me that this was a cryptid. Skinwalkers have been reported in Canada, especially with a large population of First Nation people living there, and the country definitely has its fair share of Wendigo sightings as well. Both of these creatures can mimic. Sasquatch are also all throughout Canada, and they also have the ability to mimic. So it could possibly have been any of these cryptids. As for what approached the OP's tent that night, though, is anyone's guess. What do you think it was? The final story of this episode comes from a poster who saw what they believe to be a crawler in Memphis, Tennessee. The original poster doesn't say where exactly her encounter takes place, just that she lives in a rural area in what she refers to as a one-off cul-de-sac. The closest resemblance to civilization is a church across the street. The rest of the area consists of roads, neighborhoods, and woods. There are 8 homes on the street she lives on, but hers is the only one with access to the woods that surround the area. She mentions that she always got a creepy vibe from the woods but dismissed it as her anxiety. At the time, the OP had been grounded, which left her bored for the majority of the time, and since she had seen a lot of deer while looking out her back window, she got the idea to go exploring in the woods to see if she could find anything interesting. The trees directly behind her home weren't very dense, but the further back you went, the denser they got. So she began exploring the woods and found some bones and skulls belonging to deer, some of which with the antlers still attached. During her exploration, she also found a whole car in the woods, but just the outer shell. This is where she decided to stash the interesting things she found during her visits to the woods, which would include 3 deer skulls, a handful of bones, and other odds and ends. She gathered these various items during the week but was unable to venture out over the weekend due to it storming. The following week, on Wednesday, she was finally able to return to the hollowed-out car where she kept her treasures stashed, only to find that the skulls and bones were gone. She was a bit confused, but just assumed an animal had carried them off, so she ventured out to look for them and to see what other new things she could find. As she searched, she saw a deer skull deeper in the woods, in an area she doesn't normally go to due to it being on her neighbor's land. But she didn't see a problem stepping over there really quick to pick up the skull. As she did, she noticed a bone lying nearby. She picked this up too, but immediately noticed that the bone had some blood and sinew on it, which definitely raised alarms with her. She dropped it and wiped her hand on her jeans and left it to whatever had been eating it, which she assumed to be a buzzard. Upon returning to the car while toting her skull, she saw something moving in the trees farther past the vehicle. She stopped, thinking it to be an animal that she didn't want to spook. But when she took a closer look, she realized what she saw moving around within the trees was a crawler. She describes it as being nearly white, extremely skinny, to the point where she could see its ribs, naked, hunched over, and with eyes that were almost fully black. The moment she made eye contact with this creature, it took off running before she could even react to it. When the thing was gone, she returned to her home and didn't go into the woods after that. She mentions that someone bought the property and built a house on it, so the creature is their problem now. She closes her post by saying she has heard odd noises since but hasn't seen anything. She has heard stories from farmers she has talked to and read some posts from the surrounding areas and states. She also mentions she doesn't believe anything about the supernatural unless she has proof, and what she saw that day was enough proof for her. She ends her post by asking what anyone reading her story thinks about it. In response to a comment, she gives a more detailed description of the crawler's back, saying it had visible bumps along its spine. She says it looked as if someone had shoved rocks under their skin along their spine, and it looked freaky. She also mentions how fast it ran and that it was much faster than any other animal she has seen. She felt off after seeing the creature and isn't certain that the feeling came from seeing the crawler or from her trying to wrap her mind around what she saw. The OP got a very good look at the creature, and from her very detailed description, I agree with her that this was a crawler. The fact that she also heard weird noises and stories from others in the area adds credibility to her tale. Not to mention the creepy vibe she said she also had when it came to those woods. I hear this in a lot of these stories, and it's usually a sign that something is lurking nearby. Now I will say this isn't always the case, but in a lot of cryptid encounters, people usually talk about how they find the area where they see these creatures creepy or eerie, making them feel uneasy. Then there is the off feeling she mentions coming over her after seeing this creature. This happens a lot in cryptid encounters and further points to these creatures being able to affect our heads and how we feel. This is something I've talked about a lot on this channel and fully believe. She also did the smart thing by getting out of there and not going back into those woods. I mentioned in one of the other stories from this episode how going back and investigating isn't the best of ideas when it comes to these creatures. Usually, if you leave them alone and don't go back into their territory, they will leave you alone and eventually move on. Hopefully that's the case here. What do you think about this one? And what would you do if you saw a creature like this in the woods behind your home? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.